So hello everyone. So my name is Bas Peters, and I'm going to talk to you about GitHub Actions. So it's going to be like an introduction to what GitHub Actions are. I'm a solutions engineer at GitHub, and that means that I spend most of my time working with customers. I work mostly in the Nordic countries, but I'm based in Amsterdam, where GitHub has its European headquarters. So there's about 20 people working from the Amsterdam office. So, can you raise your hand if you're familiar with this landscape? A few of you are. So this is the cloud-native landscape, and as you can see, there's a lot of small icons there, so there's a lot of tools. So this basically, the cloud-native landscape tried to help people to navigate the cloud-native tools that are available. And when they created this, at some point, a lot of people were kind of starting referring to it as like the hellscape, because it doesn't really make it easier to navigate and pick the tools you want to use. So at GitHub, we have someone in GitHub that is part of this foundation. And at some point, they were thinking like maybe we could bring those tools to the GitHub platform. Here of introducing this idea of automating workflows on the GitHub platform. We announced it at GitHub Universe last year, October, and within 24 hours we had 32,000 signups. We also got immediate, a lot of press coverage about it. And a GitHub action is code that runs when an event happens on GitHub. So they're way more than just responding to a push event and doing a build, test, package and deploy. You can use actions for practically anything on the GitHub platform. So we just refer to it as maybe an if this then that sort of solution. So a service, take for example, if you post something on Instagram, you want this event to trigger an action that, for example, posts something on Twitter. So that is a similar way of how we implemented actions. So there's events on the GitHub platform, and you can use those events as a trigger to automate something. Because in DevOps, there's, and I think almost every talk here at this conference, at some point mentions automate everything. With automation, you can, it makes tasks repeatable. It provides a predictable outcome. It reduces human errors. Another important part is, for example, in open source, automation also gives confidence to contributors. Because if you contribute to a project in open source, there will not be a peer that is, just waiting for you to open a PR and start reviewing right away. But a build automation will do. It will run the test and it will provide you with a status. And if it's green, you'll be confident and you will start continuing, or you will continue your work. So that's also a really important part of automation. And the other part, and I won't mention all the benefits of automating, but another part is it empowers developers. In GitHub, for example, any developer can deploy to production. They can simply go into Slack and do a .deploy this branch into this environment. So it allows them, automation allows them to take ownership of their work. And that's another important part. So let me give you a couple of examples. So for example, on a repo public event, you can, so if you make a repository public or create a public repository, you can, for example, check if it has a license file. So maybe that's something you want to enforce in your organization. If we open source a project, we want to make sure it meets certain standards, certain policies that we want to enforce. It should have a license file, maybe a contributing guidelines, and you can just automate that part. Or on a release event, you can package up release notes and then you can send them through SMS or email, for example, using SendGrid. On a member event, you can open up an onboarding issue, providing a ramp-up plan for a new member of your team. Provide guidelines or other important resources that person should have access to ramp up more quickly. Or on a push event to a branch, just do the build, test, publish, deploy. Also on a push event you can deploy to cloud vendors, so the most common cloud vendors are supported by GitHub Actions. And on a pull request merge event, there's for example already an action that can delete a branch automatically. So this is not something that happens automatically on the GitHub platform, so if you merge a pull request, then there is a button that allows you to delete the branch, but it's not required. You might want to keep it. But in some organizations, people say, hey, whenever you merge in your feature branch, just delete it. So you can automate that using a GitHub action. On an issue opened, you can triage an issue, for example. And on a pull request event, you can, for example, review and validate Terraform changes. So HashiCorp, for example, they created a GitHub action already that can help you to kind of validate the changes you make to your Terraform scripts. So I mentioned HashiCorp as one example of a vendor that already created a GitHub action, but there's more. So you can deploy to the most known cloud hosts. So that includes AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Heroku, SiteNow. So a lot of these vendors are already supported. There's Twilio and SendGrid support. So for example, to send SMS messages or notifications. Docker Hub, so you can push your containers to Docker Hub or update. There's also support for launch darkly, so using feature flags in your workflows. And one I like a lot is like Flick. So Flick also created an action that allows you, so you can use a Flick button. I don't know if you're familiar. Who's familiar with Flick buttons? Maybe Amazon also has these buttons, you know, with one click you can order products. So Flick has a programmable button. You can see it right there. And so when you click it, you can trigger a GitHub action. So I want to walk you through a demo. I use a recording so that I'm sure that I end in time. But at the same time, I checked the quality of the video is not perfect. So it's a bit blurry, so I apologize for that. I think it's just enough to just understand. So we have a project here. And so there is this actions button there, so we can click there, go to that page. And then we can create a workflow. And when we do not have one, we click through. And so the start is we create a workflow, so provide it with a name, so like, you know, build, test, and publish. This is an NPM project that I use here. And then I create the workflow and start adding actions to it. So I'll just start with an NPM action. So GitHub provides a list of known actions, but you can also add your own if you want. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. I'll provide the arguments, so this is just the initial install. And then I'll add another action. Use NPM again, provide a label. Again, provide the arguments. In this case, it's just test. And then I create a parallel action, so you can run actions in parallel. So I run test, and in parallel I want to run a linter. So again, I provide a label. In this case, I provide runs, because I'm not going to use npm as an executable command, but I'll have to use the ESLint. So I'll use a runs in order to override the entry point from the Docker container. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then from there we add another step that is a filter. So there's a couple of built-in like GitHub actions that allow you to kind of filter, for example. In this case, I'll use a branch filter. So only when the branch is master. So I'll just say branch master. And I could also negate this. I could say not branch master. So on branch master, I want the workflow to continue. And in this case, I'll do a publish when the branch is master. So with the parallel run, both need to complete in order to go on to the filter, and then the filter, if it matches the master, it will execute the publish. And actions are just code. So we use the HashiCorp language. So you can also write them in code if you want. You do not need to use the UI if you don't want to. And another thing is, when you create actions as they are just code, you use GitHub Flow, so the GitHub workflow, in order to create and review them. So this allows you to test and experiment in isolation of the rest of the work that's going on in a project, if you want your action to be part of a project itself. So I open a pull request, and that will immediately trigger the action on the branch at workflow and run it. So now we have a basic action for npm, so do an install test and then a linting in parallel, and then if the action is if the branch is master, it will do a publish. In this case, so in actions you can follow the progress, so it's now at the filter. So whenever you run an action, you can just go and follow its progress in the actions tab. And then from there you can also click through the log files. So you can see it's skipped here because it's not the master branch, it's the add workflow branch. We go back to the pull request. And it also provides checks, so it will report all the logging into checks. So associated to your run, you can see for every action in your workflow, you can see the output in the log files. So we're now going to add another workflow. So we've seen that you can run actions in parallel, but you can also have multiple workflows. So we create another one, and we give it the weird name shaking finger, and use a different event now. So now we respond to the pull request event. So you can see here that GitHub provides a lot of events that you can use to trigger workflows. So it's not just like on a push event. And we add an action to our workflow. And in this case, we're going to reference an open source action that someone in the community created, in this case Jess Frizzell. And she created the shaking finger action. You can see that you can point to a specific branch, so if you're still experimenting, you can also reference a specific branch for an action. And the other part here is that we use a secret here, so we use a GitHub token because we're doing some API calls in this action. So we need to add, so you can add secrets to your workflows. Again, it's just code, so we added another workflow. So all the workflows end up in a single main workflow file. And we commit this to our pull request branch. And once we commit, it will trigger the event, so we'll trigger both the push event and the pull request event. So with this one, we won't see anything like different from our previous run, apart from that it run the shaking finger action. So in order to see what shaking finger does, we are going to the code and we're going to break a build. So we just go to the test file, first to the branch, and we just make sure that we are, I'll just change the 200 and the 201, so that will break our build. So we break the test rather than the code, but it's just to see what happens. Add the commit to the workflow branch. and then it will run the action again, the workflow. And we see that it breaks the build, so the change we made, and we have the shaking finger. So we have Conan O'Brien shaking his finger to us to alert us that something is wrong with our code. So this was a brief introduction and overview of how you can create actions on GitHub, workflows and actions. So one thing, GitHub actions, they are configured as code. So if you feel comfortable just using the HCL language, you can just code them by hand. You can just create in a .github folder a main workflow file and just start, typing your workflow and providing the separate actions. So the GitHub actions are grouped together in workflow blocks. So that is your workflow that it shall execute. And so within the workflow block, you provide action blocks. Now in an action block, an action on GitHub is just a Docker container. So it runs containers all the way down. And I can reference, like I did with Jess Frazel's shaking finger action, I can reference so a user, then repository, and then a branch to reference an action. I can also just bring in a Docker container. So if I just want to execute some, command line stuff, so a run, I can just bring in a Docker container, like an Alpine or whatever. If I just want to run some shell script things, I can just do that. So there's no need, it doesn't need to be an action that lives somewhere as a GitHub repository. You can just bring in something from Docker Hub and it pulls it for you and will execute your commands. And the third way is you can also create what we call like private actions. So let's say you have an action that is very specific to your project. You can just create the action inside the repository, for example, in the .github folder, and create it there, and it will be scoped only to your project. The other thing is we've built in filters. So we've seen already one filter in the demo that used like the branch filter, so to check whether a branch is master. And you can also use patterns there if you want to, so it can match like features, a star, for example. But there's other filters that you can use. So you can use a tag filter, so if some tag is applied or some tag is deleted. The branch I already talked about. When a branch is deleted, you can trigger by label, so if some label is added or updated or removed, for example. You can also use the action. I'll show you in a sec how that works. And then you can use the actor, so the user that triggered the workflow, for example. And you can also use the environment, so whether an environment is like development or staging or production. Of course, you can always write your own. I mean, you can basically write everything you want. But these are kind of built-in filters that we provide. So there is a github.com/actions organization on GitHub that provides actions that we provide ourselves to you. But like I showed earlier, there's also a lot of vendors, for example, that provide actions already. But if you want to deploy to like common cloud vendors, for example, this is a perfect start. So it's just github.com/actions, and you find a lot of examples. So like I told you, actions are triggered by events. So the whole purpose of actions is really to provide you with a way to automate everything. So whatever action you want to use, so whatever event you want to use on GitHub, it allows you to automate parts of it. And I think that's a really important difference from CI/CD solutions. So it's GitHub actions are not just to do CI/CD. GitHub actions are really to kind of automate any part of your workflow on GitHub. I give you one more example that uses the issues. So if there is an issues event And in this case, it will use the action. So you can see on the right-hand side. So in this case, it will use opened. So this is a triage issue example. So I create a new issue. I provide a title. That is like asking a question. So where can I learn more about GitHub Actions? Question mark. And when I create this issue, it will trigger an action. For this demo, we used the Lewis AI. But you can also use, for example, Recast. So you just train a model with a bunch of actions that have like bug or question or feature in it. And then you can just call this the API and get a response, what label to add, and you can add that label. So this is one example on how you can create an action with something different than using a push event. Like I said, GitHub Actions are executed as containers. So you can use any language, for example. So any programming language you feel comfortable with. Maybe performance is something to note, but if you're more comfortable just writing Python or Ruby, you can use, you just pick a container that provides the programming language that you want to use, and you can just write your action. A lot of actions use just simple like shell scripts because it allows you to run on a very minimal container, so it has a faster execution, sometimes compared to containers that provide other programming languages because they're just larger. So let's look at the anatomy, the components of an action. So an action has a Docker file and it has an entry point typically. And the Docker file is just a few lines. So all these labels are just metadata. So it's just about, I bring in this case, this is to run Maven, so Java Maven. So it brings in a Maven Docker container, and it then refers to an entry point. And the entry point is really simple. It's just like running Maven and then any arguments you provide in the args field of your actions. And that's about it. So those two files are a complete GitHub action. So it's like a CLI wrapper in this case to run Maven commands. GitHub Actions and the whole workflow provides access to a file system. And the file system, there's two important parts of this file system. So one is it provides a copy of your repository. So we bring in a copy of the repo into the container for you, or into the file system that is accessible by the containers that run your actions to get access to source code. And that source code is also modifiable if you want. The other important part is that every event on GitHub creates a payload. So it's a JSON file providing details around the event that gets triggered. So that is relevant information that you can use in your actions. And by default, an action provides environment variables like GitHub Workspace, references to the folder that contains your source code. And the GitHub event path provides you with a reference to the event payload of the triggered event. So to give you an example, let me see if my pointer works. Yeah. So we read the action, for example, here on the top line. So this is the path to our payload. And in this case, we just use the JQ in order to read the .action field. And then we check whether this action is opened, and then we want to continue. So we want to fail fast if this action is not relevant. And then we extract some information. So we get the issue number and we get the issue title. And then we run our action. So this comes from like this triage issue example I showed earlier. So I do not show the rest of the code here that calls the Lewis to get the label. But this is the information we just extract from the payload of our event. What is really important is that GitHub Actions are built by the community and they are run by us. So we run actions on the GitHub platform. So that means you do not have to take care of any infrastructure or anything in order to run those actions. We take care of that on the GitHub platform. And built by you means that what we want to do with actions is really to spark a new community on GitHub, whether it's like the open source community, individual developers, or tool vendors, to provide actions on the GitHub platform that you can use in your workflows. So hopefully with actions, we just bring a whole new community to the GitHub platform that can help you to automate parts of your workflows. There's one resource that I can recommend you to start using actions, and that is Learning Lab. So if you go to lab.github.com, there is a lot of training materials available there, just public material that you can go through. It provides a whole learning path. So if you're not familiar with GitHub, for example, you can learn about how to deal with a merge conflict using pull requests and things like that. And there's also like a very basic Hello World Actions demo there, or like course that will guide you through creating a very basic action, and that's a good start. The learning materials also provide resources, so relevant resources, both from GitHub, like documentation and the actions organization on GitHub, but also community resources. Another thing is there's a tool created, so-called Act, and it allows you to run actions locally. It's great for testing, but you can even run them, locally to just run actual actions on your project. It's a very neat tool to use, because especially getting started with actions, you do not want to push your code all the time to GitHub in order to test your action. So you can do a lot of the work just locally, and then once you're happy with your results, it's ready for review, for example, you just push your changes to GitHub, open a pull request, and request a review by your peers. So it's a really great tool. And well done, you see the whole flow. It supports multiple workflows also. And you can run complex actions. So this is a workflow that was also built by Jess Frizzell. It deploys to a lot of different container registries and to a lot of different cloud environments. And you can see a lot of these processes running in parallel. So you can easily use GitHub actions in order to deploy, for example, in hybrid cloud environments. There's more on GitHub that allows you to automate things than just GitHub actions. So you might be familiar with, of course, there's webhooks on GitHub, so that allow to use something with events. There's GitHub apps, but creating GitHub apps has quite a steep learning curve, especially if you want to create GitHub apps in languages other than JavaScript. So JavaScript is very well supported, especially thanks to this robot here called Probot. So Probot is a framework that wraps GitHub apps, so makes it easy to create like integrations with GitHub. There's a lot of community Probot apps around that can help you in order to automate parts of your workflows. And there's a few differences. So if you want to automate a part of your workflow, it makes sense to just consider the options, because GitHub actions might not be the solution for everything. What is very obvious is, so if you want to automate a part of your workflow and you need access to the source code, it might be that GitHub actions is a great way of doing the automation, because it allows you to access source code. It has a copy of the source code on a file system that is accessible by the container that runs the action. On the other hand, a Probot app can be much faster, because Probot apps are just express servers. They just run as a server. They're available all the time. So that means if you just have a, let me put the triage issue I showed earlier, for example. So I created this issue and I added a title, where can I learn more about GitHub Actions, and that added a label. So the Probot version we have for this, it runs faster than the GitHub action. So if speed, and if you use the API, so if you just want to use the API, and you really care about responsiveness and speed, then you might want to use Probot. However, with Probot, of course, you're bound to using JavaScript, although you can always create a GitHub app using your favorite language. So that might be a reason to use Probot. And there's, you can use Glitch, for example, or like there's a lot of Probot apps that run inside now. So there's a very cost-effective ways of also deploying Probot apps and running them. But especially, if you want to use your favorite programming language, if you need access to the source code, then, using GitHub Actions is a really convenient way of building automations into your workflows. So GitHub Actions is not a replacement for GitHub Apps or Probot. An interesting example again is like Learning Lab, for example. So we built Learning Lab as a GitHub app, because it's kind of a continuous interaction. So it's like bot-assisted training. So there's a continuous response from a bot while you're making progress during the course. And we want this to be like a very smooth and fast experience. So there we will use like a GitHub app rather than running an action. So GitHub Actions today is still in a, you could say like limited public beta. So that means you need to sign up. So if you want to give GitHub Actions a try, you need to sign up for the beta. So if you want to do that, feel free. Sometimes we're a bit behind with signing up people. So feel free to reach out if you really want to play with it and within, let's say, a week you do not have access. Feel free to just ping me. For us, it's still really important to collect feedback from the community. So to understand what people want to do with actions. Because for us, it's also like an adventure, like an experiment in, what is the need? So what kind of automation needs do people have on the GitHub platform? So we want to learn from you how you want to use actions, and of course make improvements according to your feedback. The documentation is at developer.github.com/action. So there you can find documentation. Again, if you have any suggestions for improvements, feel free to reach out. I think most of the relevant parts are there in order to get started. Of course, it's always a great thing to just start with the github.com/actions to look at other examples. So how are other people building those actions and reuse them? For example, I'm not a star in doing shell scripting. So, I just looked into some of Jess Frazel's great actions she created. She's really good at doing like bash and shell scripting. So, you can quickly learn from others' examples and you apply them into your own actions. So I mentioned this one already a few times because it's an important organization on GitHub where we collect a lot of actions that can be useful in your workflow, so you don't have to write them yourself. But again, this is also like, the community will create actions, so they will be available all across the GitHub platform. So just to summarize, with GitHub Actions, you can run code to respond to like any event on the GitHub platform. That's one. So not just push, not just pull requests, but you can use issues when a new member is added, when the scope of a repo changes, like to public, for example. And GitHub will run anything in a Docker container. So there's like, you have complete freedom. One question I have to you in this context is, and I think most of you, who is comfortable using Docker files? Can you raise your hands, please? So most of you are, because that is one of our like concerns, is if people that want to create actions feel comfortable in using Docker files to automate things. So we are looking into ways also kind of to make it easier to use actions. So for example, actions can be added to Marketplace. So there's a very neat like UI-based workflow in order to bring actions into your projects. We're also considering like having like, you know, recommendations. So let's say you create like a JavaScript project. We can provide you with, you know, some kind of advice in how you can create, how you can benefit from using actions in your workflows, for example. And like I showed you, the Docker container comes with a clone of your repo, so it has a copy of the repository, so you can use the code in your actions, and it has the payload of the event, so that provides a lot of valuable information that you can use in your actions. Another thing is finally is like GitHub actions, they support secrets, so you can use secret values, so you can safely use tokens, for example, and every action comes with a GitHub token that has a limited scope to your repository that you can also use to run API calls, for example. So this is what I wanted to share with you about GitHub actions.